morning air was cold when Grace Miller broke through the line of royal guards and grabbed the reins of the king's carriage with both hands. Her heart was pounding so hard that she could barely hear the shouts around her. 2 guards seized her arms at once, but she held on to the leather straps and refused to let go, even as her feet slid across the stone courtyard. "The carriage is a trap," she cried out, her voice cracking from fear. "Please, Your Majesty, do not get inside. If you leave in this carriage today, you will not reach the summit alive." The entire courtyard went silent. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her at once. Nobles in fine coats, soldiers in polished armor, servants carrying trunks and baskets, all of them froze where they stood and stared at the kitchen maid who had just dared to touch the royal carriage. Alpha King Edward Stone stood on the steps of the palace, one boot already on the carriage stair. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and gray eyes that were known across 7 territories for their calm, unreadable stillness. Men said he could stare down a storm. Now those famous eyes turned toward Grace, and she felt them land on her like a weight. "Let go of the reins," said Henry Cross, the king's beta and closest advisor, stepping forward with a tight smile. "You have lost your mind, girl. Guards, take her to the cells before she embarrasses herself further." "No, wait, please listen to me," Grace begged, twisting against the hands that held her. "I am not mad. I know how this sounds. I know I am nobody. But I am telling you the truth. Something is wrong with that carriage. If the king rides in it through the mountains, he will die. I swear it on my life." Laughter rippled through the crowd of nobles. One lady covered her mouth with a gloved hand. An old lord shook his head and muttered something about kitchen girls and too much imagination. Henry Cross laughed the loudest of all, a warm, easy laugh that invited everyone else to laugh with him. "On your life," Henry repeated, amused. "A generous offer, since your life is worth about as much as the potatoes you peel. Your Majesty, forgive this delay. The summit waits, and the Eastern Alphas do not like to be kept waiting." But Edward Stone had not moved. He had not laughed. He was still watching Grace, and something in his gaze had sharpened. He came down the steps slowly, and the courtyard seemed to hold its breath as he crossed the stones toward her. The guards straightened. Grace felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to stand tall. She had come this far. She would not crumble now. The king stopped in front of her. Up close, he was even larger than she had realized, and the quiet power that rolled off him made the air feel heavy. He looked at her face, at her plain gray dress dusted with flour, at her raw, work-worn hands still gripping the reins. Then he looked at those hands more closely. They were shaking. But Edward had spent his whole life reading fear in people. He knew the trembling of someone who was afraid of him. He had seen it 1,000 times, in enemies, in servants, in kings. This was different. This girl was not shaking because she feared his anger. She was shaking because she feared for him. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was low and even, and somehow it silenced the last of the laughter. "Grace, Your Majesty. Grace Miller. I work in the lower kitchens." "And how does a girl from the lower kitchens come to know anything about my carriage, Grace Miller?" Grace's throat tightened. This was the question she could not fully answer. Not here, not in front of all these people, because the truth would raise 100 more questions about who she was and where she came from, and those questions would destroy her. So she gave him the only peace she could afford to give. "I heard something I was not supposed to hear," she said quietly. "Late at night, near the cellars, 2 voices. I did not see their faces, but they spoke about the journey east, and they spoke about the carriage, and the way they spoke made my blood turn cold. Please, Your Majesty, take a horse, take a different coach, take anything but this one." Henry Cross stepped between them smoothly. "Your Majesty, this is absurd. The carriage was inspected this very morning by the royal guard. Every wheel, every panel, every strap. It is the safest vehicle in the kingdom." This girl heard 2 drunk stable hands gossiping in the dark and dreamed up an assassination. Shall we delay a peace summit, a summit that took 3 years to arrange, because a potato girl had a nightmare? Murmurs of agreement rose from the nobles. The summit in the Eastern Territories was the most important political event in a generation. 4 rival Alpha Kings, old enemies with old wounds, were finally coming to one table to talk peace instead of war. If Edward arrived late, or worse, did not arrive at all, the fragile trust holding the summit together could collapse. Everyone knew it. Grace knew it too, And that was exactly what terrified her, because a man clever enough to plan what she had overheard would know it as well. Edward held up one hand, and the murmurs died instantly. For a long moment, he said nothing. He looked at the carriage, black and gleaming, its golden crest shining in the morning sun. He looked at his beta, whose smile was patient and reasonable. He looked at the maid, whose eyes were wet but steady, and who had just risked prison, or worse, to shout a warning that made her sound insane. A strange feeling moved through him, something he could not name. It was more than instinct. When he looked at this girl, something deep in his chest stirred, like a memory he could not reach. Her scent drifted toward him on the cold air, mostly kitchen smoke and dried herbs, but underneath it, there was something else, something faint and hidden, and it pulled at him in a way that made no sense at all. He pushed the feeling aside. He was a king. Kings did not act on strange feelings in front of their courts. "Release her," he said. The guards let go. Grace stumbled, caught herself, and finally released the reins. Her palms were marked red where the leather had bitten into them. "The departure stands," Edward announced to the courtyard, his voice carrying to every corner. "We leave within the hour, as planned. In this carriage, as planned. The summit will not be delayed." Grace's heart dropped like a stone. "Your Majesty, no, please." "However," Edward continued, and now his gray eyes fixed on her again. "It seems my traveling party is short one servant. Someone must manage the tea, the meals, the small comforts of the road. Grace Miller, you will join the royal convoy for the journey east." The courtyard erupted in whispers. Henry Cross's smile flickered, just for half a second, so briefly that no one noticed. No one except Grace. She saw it, that tiny crack in his pleasant mask, and in that instant, a horrible understanding began to form in her mind, one she did not dare speak aloud. She dropped into a low bow to hide her face. "As you command, Your Majesty," she whispered. An hour later, the great gates of the capital opened, and the royal convoy rolled out onto the eastern road. 12 mounted guards rode ahead, 12 behind. Supply wagons rumbled in the middle, and at the heart of it all rolled the black carriage with the golden crest, carrying the Alpha King toward the mountains. Grace rode in the servant's wagon near the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on that carriage. Every turn of its wheels sounded like a countdown to her. What no one in the convoy knew was that before departure, Edward had quietly pulled aside the captain of his shadow guard, a silent man named Oliver Hart, and given him a private order. "Search the carriage again. Not the ordinary inspection. Take it apart with your eyes. Trust nothing." Oliver had searched for 40 minutes. He had checked the doors, the floor, the seats, the roof, the harness, the brakes. He had found nothing. Nothing at all. And that, Edward thought, as the city walls disappeared behind him, and the mountains rose dark and jagged on the horizon, was almost the most troubling part. Because when he had looked into Grace Miller's eyes, he had believed her. So if the danger was real, it meant the trap had been built by someone skilled enough to hide it from his very best men. It meant the enemy was already inside his house. The wheels turned. The mountains came closer, and in the servant's wagon, Grace Miller closed her eyes and prayed she was not already too late. The first night on the road, the convoy camped in a wide meadow beside a stream. Fires were lit, tents were raised, and the smell of roasting meat drifted through the cold evening air. Grace worked without stopping, carrying water, serving bread, cleaning pots, because working kept her hands from shaking and her mind from spinning. She was pouring tea outside the king's tent when a shadow fell over her. "Walk with me," said Edward Stone. It was not a request. Grace set down the kettle and followed him to the edge of the camp, where the firelight faded and the stream whispered over dark stones. 2 shadow guards stood at a distance, close enough to protect, far enough not to hear. "Tell me again what you heard," the king said. "Every word, leave nothing out." Grace took a slow breath. "It was 4 nights ago. I was in the cold cellar, fetching salted fish for the morning. The cellar connects to an old drainage tunnel that nobody uses. I heard voices coming through it, 2 men. One voice was rough, a stranger. The other was smooth, educated, a voice used to giving orders. Did you recognize it?" Grace hesitated, and Edward saw the hesitation. "I could not swear to it," she said carefully. "The tunnel twists the sound, but the smooth voice said the eastern journey would solve everything. He said the mountains would do the work. and the world would call it an accident, and no one would ever look deeper, because everyone knows how dangerous the past can be. The rough voice asked about the guards, and the smooth voice laughed and said the guards would inspect everything and find nothing, because the work was already done, and it was invisible. Invisible, Edward repeated quietly. Those were his words, Your Majesty. Then they spoke lower, and I only caught pieces. Something about waiting until the high road, something about the deep ravine. I stood in that freezing cellar until my feet went numb, too afraid to move, in case they heard me. When the voices finally stopped, I ran. Why come to me in the courtyard, in front of everyone? Why not send a message quietly? Grace let out a small, bitter laugh. I tried, Your Majesty. For 3 days, I tried. I asked to speak with the steward, and I was told to get back to work. I gave a note to a guard, and I watched him throw it in a fire. A kitchen maid claiming the king is in danger. With no proof, no names, no faces. Nobody would carry that message up the stairs. The courtyard was my last chance. I knew they might arrest me. I decided it was worth it. Edward studied her in the dim light. She was young, perhaps 20, with tired eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw. Everything about her story was thin. No names, no faces, no evidence. His best man had searched the carriage and found nothing. Every rule of logic told him this was nonsense. And yet, you understand, he said, that if you are lying to me, or playing some game, the consequences will be severe. If I am lying, Grace answered, meeting his eyes, then when we cross the mountains safely, you may do with me whatever you wish. But if I am right, Your Majesty, then somewhere in this camp tonight, someone is watching you smile, and eat, and plan your summit, and counting the hours until the high road. A log cracked in a distant fire. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse snorted softly. Edward looked back at the camp, at the ring of tents glowing warm and gold, at his soldiers laughing quietly over their food, at Henry Cross's tall silhouette moving between the fires, greeting the men, clapping shoulders, trusted by everyone. The strange feeling stirred in his chest again, stronger this time. Get some sleep, Grace Miller, the king said at last. We reach the mountains in 2 days, and from this moment on, you will report anything unusual directly to me. Anything at all. No matter how small. Yes, Your Majesty. She bowed and walked back toward the fires. Edward remained by the stream a while longer, alone in the dark, listening to the water and thinking about invisible things. 2 days, he thought. 2 days to the high road. Whatever was coming, it was coming fast. The second day of travel began with a hard frost and a sky the color of iron. The convoy moved fast along the eastern road, and with every mile, the land grew wilder. Farms gave way to forests. Forests gave way to rocky hills, and far ahead, growing taller by the hour, stood the Black Ridge Mountains, a wall of dark stone with peaks lost in cloud. Grace could not take her eyes off them. Somewhere up there was the high road. Somewhere up there was the deep ravine. She had barely slept. All night she had lain awake in the servant's wagon, listening to the sounds of the camp, trying to match every voice she heard to the smooth voice from the cellar. Twice she had thought she recognized it. Twice she had told herself she was imagining things. The truth was that the voice she kept coming back to, again and again, belonged to a man so trusted, so beloved, so close to the king, that accusing him without proof would not just fail. It would end her. Henry Cross rode near the front of the convoy on a beautiful chestnut horse, laughing with the captain of the guard, telling stories that made the soldiers grin. He was the perfect beta, loyal for 15 years, the king's oldest friend, the man who had held the kingdom together during the border wars, while Edward fought on the front lines. And yet, Grace watched him, the way a mouse watches a hawk, and she noticed things. Small things. She noticed that Henry always seemed to know exactly where the king was without looking. She noticed that when the convoy stopped to rest the horses, Henry walked past the royal carriage and let his hand trail along its side, just briefly, like a man checking that something precious was still in place. She noticed that at meals, he steered every conversation toward the summit, the schedule, the pressure of time, as if planting the same thought over and over. We cannot slow down. We cannot stop. We must keep moving. At midday, the convoy halted beside a river crossing to water the horses. Grace was carrying a tray of bread and cheese to the guards when she passed close to the royal carriage. and heard a sound that stopped her heart. A soft creak. It was faint, almost nothing. Just the wood, settling as the carriage cooled. Any other person would have walked past without a thought. But Grace had grown up around wagons and workshops, in a life she had buried deep and never spoke of, and her ears had been trained by a man who used to say that wood talks, and if you listen closely, it will tell you when it is hurt. That creak was wrong. It was not the sound of settling wood. It was thinner, sharper, like something under strain, like something holding on. She slowed her steps, straining to listen, but a group of soldiers walked between her and the carriage, and the moment was gone. She stood there with her tray, cold all over, and made a decision. That night, when the camp slept, she would look under that carriage herself. The chance never came. That evening, the convoy did not make camp in the open. They reached the fortified way station at the foot of the mountains, a walled compound with stables and guarded gates, where royal travelers always spent the night before the mountain crossing. The carriage was rolled into a locked coach house, and 2 of Henry's own men were posted at its doors. Henry's own men, not the king's shadow guard. Grace noticed that too. She found Oliver Hart, the captain of the shadow guard, standing near the stables in the dusk. Approaching him took all her courage. He was a lean, quiet man, with a scarred jaw, and eyes that missed nothing, and everyone in the palace was afraid of him. "Captain," she said softly. "The carriage. Who chose the guards on the coach house tonight?" Oliver looked down at her for a long moment. "The beta assigned them. Why?" "When you inspected the carriage before we left, did you check the axles? Not just look at them. Did you touch them? Underneath, where the wood meets the iron?" "I checked everything the eye can reach." "The eye," Grace repeated. "Captain, my father was a wheelwright." The words were out before she could stop them. The first true piece of her past she had spoken aloud in 6 years, and they left a strange ache in her chest. "He built and repaired coaches all his life. He taught me that a clever man never damages what you can see. He damages what you can only hear and feel. A cut inside the wood, a weakness under the iron collar, packed with wax and dust so it looks whole. In the yard, in the cold, the wood holds. But the mountain road twists and drops and pounds for hours, and the strain grows and grows, and then, on some steep turn—" She could not finish the sentence. Oliver Hart said nothing, but something changed in his face. "I heard the wood creak today at the river," Grace pressed on. "It was the wrong sound, Captain. I know how that sounds coming from a maid. But you serve the king's life, not the king's schedule. Please, check again. Check with your hands." For a moment, she thought he would walk away. Instead, he glanced toward the coach house, where Henry's 2 men stood in the torchlight, and his eyes narrowed slightly. "The beta's men have orders to admit no one until morning," he said slowly. "Odd orders for a coach house." He looked back at Grace. "The king told me you would report unusual things. Consider it reported. Go to your quarters, girl, and speak of this to no one." Grace barely slept for the 2nd night in a row. Before dawn, the convoy assembled in the gray half-light. The mountain crossing would take the full day, up the switchbacks to the high road, along the ridge above the great ravine, then down the far side to the eastern valleys by nightfall. The horses stamped and steamed in the cold. The carriage was rolled out of the coach house, polished and gleaming, and Edward Stone stepped toward it. Grace stood frozen by the servant's wagon. Had Oliver checked it? Had he found anything? She could read nothing in the shadow captain's blank face, and the king's expression was as calm as ever as he climbed inside, and the door closed behind him. The gates opened. The convoy rolled out and began to climb. The mountain road was carved into the living rock, and it rose in long, brutal switchbacks, hairpin after hairpin, the drop beside the road growing deeper with every turn. By mid-morning, the trees were gone. By noon, clouds drifted below them, and the convoy moved along a shelf of stone with a cliff wall on one side, and open sky on the other. Then they reached the high road. Grace saw the ravine and felt her stomach turn. It was a monstrous split in the mountain, so deep that its bottom was lost in blue shadow, and the road ran along its edge for miles. The wind howled up out of the depths. Pebbles kicked loose by the horses skittered over the rim and vanished without a sound. "The mountains will do the work," the smooth voice had said. "The world will call it an accident. Here, it would happen here." The convoy pressed forward. A mile passed. 2. The carriage swayed and jolted over the rough stone. and every jolt went through Grace like a blade. She was riding close behind it now, having begged a place on the rear supply wagon, and she strained her ears against the wind, listening, listening. And then she heard it. The creak. The same wrong, thin, straining sound, but louder now, and repeating with every rotation of the right rear wheel. Creak, creak, creak. Faster as the road tilted downhill toward a long curve that bent along the very lip of the ravine. Wood talks, her father used to say, and when it starts to cry out, you have minutes, not hours. Grace did not think. She stood up on the moving wagon and screamed with everything in her lungs. Stop the carriage. Stop the carriage now. The wheel is failing. Stop. Chaos erupted. Guards wheeled their horses. Voices shouted over each other. Henry Cross spun in his saddle, his face white, roaring that the road was too narrow to stop, that they must keep moving to the wider ground ahead. And for 3 terrible seconds, the convoy did keep moving, the carriage rolling on toward the curve. Then the carriage door burst open, and Edward Stone's voice cut through everything like thunder. Halt! The convoy stopped. The king leapt down onto the road, and at that exact moment, with a sound like a snapping bone, the right rear axle gave way. The corner of the carriage crashed down onto the stone. The broken wheel bounced, rolled, and sailed over the edge of the ravine, spinning silently into the blue depths. The carriage body screeched sideways across the rock, dragged by the panicking horses, and came to rest with its rear corner hanging over the void, held by nothing but the weight of the front half, and the desperate hands of a dozen guards who threw themselves onto the harness. Silence fell, broken only by the wind and the heaving breath of men and horses. Edward stood in the middle of the high road, staring at the wreck that would have been his tomb. If he had been inside, if it had happened at speed, it had happened 30 feet later, on the curve. Oliver Hart was already under the wrecked carriage. When he emerged, his face was grim, and in his hands he held a section of the broken axle. He carried it straight to the king, and he spoke loudly and clearly, so that every man on that road could hear. Cut, your majesty. Sawed from the inside, more than halfway through, then packed with wax mixed with soot and stone dust. Invisible to the eye, undetectable by touch, unless you knew exactly where to press. This was done by a master, and it was done to fail exactly here, on the high road. He paused. Last night, on the girl's warning, I found the tampering and reinforced the axle in secret with an iron brace, hoping to trap whoever came to check the work. The brace is the only reason the wheel lasted this long, and the only reason the failure was slow instead of sudden. Every head turned. Every eye found Grace Miller, standing small and wind-whipped beside the supply wagon. The kitchen maid, the mad girl from the courtyard, the girl who had just been proven right in front of 40 witnesses, on the edge of a ravine, beside a sabotaged royal carriage. Edward Stone crossed the road toward her, and the look on his face was something no one in his court had ever seen before. But Grace was not looking at the king. Over his shoulder, for half a heartbeat, she was watching Henry Cross. And Henry Cross, pale and silent at the edge of the crowd, was not looking at the broken axle, or the ravine, or the king who had just escaped death. He was looking at her, and in his eyes, behind the shock, something cold was waking up. The convoy could not remain on the high road. The wrecked carriage was stripped of its crest and pushed against the cliff wall. The king mounted a spare horse, and the shaken column pressed on, until the ravine finally fell behind them, and the road widened onto a stony plateau, where an old watchtower stood against the sky. There, with hours of daylight lost and nerves stretched thin, Edward ordered camp. He also ordered something else, quietly, to Oliver Hart alone. From this hour, the shadow guard answered only to the king. Every message leaving the camp was to be intercepted. Every man's movements were to be watched, and Grace Miller was to be guarded at all times, without her knowledge, by the 2 best men Oliver had. Because Edward had been thinking, hard and fast, the entire climb down from the high road, and every path his thoughts took, led to the same dark place. The saboteur had needed access to the royal coach house in the capital, which only a handful of senior men possessed. The saboteur had needed to know the exact route and schedule, which was restricted to the War Council. And when Grace had screamed her warning on the high road, one man had shouted to keep the convoy moving. One man had assigned his own guards to the coach house at the way station. One man had argued in the courtyard, smoothly and reasonably, that the departure must not be delayed, and the maid must be dragged to the cells. Edward had known Henry Cross for 15 years. They had fought side by side. He had trusted Henry with his kingdom, his secrets, and his life. And now, sitting alone in the watchtower as the sun went down, the Alpha King forced himself to face the unbearable question. What if the enemy inside his house was the man he loved like a brother? He had no proof. Suspicion was not proof, and a king who accused his own beta of treason without proof would tear his kingdom in half on the eve of a peace summit. If he was wrong, he would destroy an innocent friend and hand his enemies a gift. If he was right, then the moment Henry sensed suspicion, the man would either flee to his hidden allies or strike again, faster and more desperately. So Edward made the hardest choice of all. He would pretend to suspect nothing. He would smile at Henry, consult Henry, trust Henry, while the shadow guard wove an invisible net around the camp and waited for the traitor to make the next move. He did not have to wait long. The attack came 3 hours after midnight. Grace was awake when it began, because sleep had abandoned her completely, and so she heard the first sound, a soft whistle from the rocks above the camp, like a night bird that was not a night bird. She sat up in the servants' tent, her skin prickling. A second whistle answered from the opposite ridge. Then the sentry on the north side gave a single sharp cry, and the night exploded. Dark figures poured down the slopes from 2 directions, men in gray cloaks with soot-blackened faces, moving fast and silent among the tents. Steel flashed in the dying firelight. Horses screamed and tore at their pickets. The camp erupted into shouting, running shadows, and the terrible ringing clash of blades. Grace scrambled out of the tent into madness. A guard shoved her down behind a supply wagon and spun away to meet 2 attackers at once. She pressed herself against the wheels, heart slamming, and through the gap beneath the wagon, she watched boots and firelight and chaos, and she did what she had always done to survive. She watched, she listened, she remembered, and so she saw things that others, lost in the fight, did not see. She saw that the attackers, for all their speed and skill, were avoiding the king's tent. The assault crashed against the north and east of the camp, drawing the guards outward, but the gray men did not press toward the center, where Edward stood in the open with a blade in his hand, terrifying and unmissable in the firelight. What kind of assassins ignored their target? The kind, Grace realized with ice in her veins, who were not there to kill. They were there to perform. She saw a gray-cloaked man run past Henry Cross at half speed, swing wide, and miss him by an arm's length before melting back into the dark. She saw Henry stagger anyway. And then, in the deep shadow between 2 wagons, not 20 feet from her hiding place, she saw the thing she would never be able to unsee. Henry Cross, believing himself unobserved, drew his own knife, set his jaw, and cut himself along the outside of his left shoulder. A shallow, careful, angled cut, in the one place a man could reach easily and explain easily. He hissed through his teeth, smeared the blood down his sleeve, tore the fabric to make the wound look ragged, and then threw himself out into the firelight with a roar, blade high, the picture of a beta, fighting for his king. Grace clamped her own hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. The attack ended as suddenly as it had begun. A horn sounded from the ridge, and the gray men vanished into the rocks like smoke, leaving behind 3 of their own fallen, and a camp full of wounded, furious soldiers. Pursuit into Black Mountains at night was impossible, and everyone knew it. The whole assault, from first whistle to last, had lasted less than 10 minutes. By the time the fires were rebuilt, the story of the night had already written itself, exactly as it had been designed to. The camp buzzed with it. Assassins had struck, the guards had beaten them back, and the brave beta had been wounded defending the king's tent. Men clasped Henry's good shoulder as the healer bound his wound. Someone pressed a cup of hot wine into his hand. Henry bore it all with grim, modest courage, saying only that he was glad the king was safe, and that this proved the enemy was desperate. And then, in front of everyone, Henry Cross played his master stroke. "Your Majesty," he said, loudly enough for half the camp to hear, "we must face the obvious. The carriage was sabotaged in the capital. This attack found us on a route known to few. Someone is feeding our enemies information from inside this convoy." He paused, and his eyes traveled slowly, sorrowfully, across the crowd of soldiers and servants, and came to rest on Grace. "And forgive me," But I must say it plainly. There is one person here who knew the carriage would fail before it failed. One person who joined this convoy only days ago. One person whose warnings always come at the perfect moment to win your Majesty's trust. I ask a simple question. How does a kitchen maid know the things she knows? The silence that followed was terrible. Grace felt every eye in the camp turn toward her for the second time in 2 days, but this time there was no wonder in the stares. There was suspicion, hard and hungry. Soldiers who had blessed her name on the high road that afternoon now looked at her and saw a spy who had known too much. It was brilliant. It was so brilliant she almost admired it. He was taking his greatest danger, her knowledge, and turning it into a noose. I warned the king, because I overheard the plot, she said, and hated how thin her voice sounded against the night. If I were the traitor, why would I stop the carriage from falling? To buy trust, Henry answered gently, sadly, like a man performing an unpleasant duty. To place yourself beside the king's ear, on the eve of the most important summit in our history. A failed accident costs your masters nothing. A trusted agent inside the royal circle is worth 1,000 broken axles. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Grace's mouth went dry. He had an answer for everything. He had prepared this. And what did she have? The truth. She had seen him cut his own shoulder in the dark, and she understood with perfect, hopeless clarity that if she said that sentence out loud, right now, with no proof, the word of a maid against the wounded hero of the hour, she would not be believed. She would be finished. Whatever thread of doubt she planted would be buried with her in some cell, and the king would be left alone, inside the closing trap. So Grace did the hardest thing she had ever done. She swallowed the truth and lowered her eyes. I am not a spy, she said quietly. That is all I can say. That, said Henry softly, is not enough. It is enough for tonight. Edward's voice was flat and final. He stepped into the firelight between them, and though his face showed nothing, Grace felt his gaze pass over her, unreadable. This girl saved my life in front of 40 witnesses. You raise fair questions, Henry, and they will be answered, but not by firelight in the middle of the night, with blood still wet on the ground. Double the watch. Tend the wounded. We move at dawn. He turned away, then paused. The maid will be kept under guard until we understand more. For everyone's safety, including hers. 2 soldiers moved to Grace's side. As they led her toward a small tent at the center of the camp, she caught one last glimpse of Henry Cross watching her go, his bandaged shoulder gleaming white in the firelight, his face full of noble sorrow. And in the privacy of the small tent, under guard, with the whole camp believing her a spy, Grace Miller sat down in the dark, buried her face in her hands, and allowed herself one silent minute of despair. Then she lifted her head, wiped her eyes, and began to think. Because she had noticed one more thing during the attack, one small detail she had told no one, and it changed everything. When the horn had sounded and the gray men fled, one of them had turned back for an instant at the edge of the dark. He had looked directly at Henry Cross, and he had touched 2 fingers to his brow. Not a signal between strangers, a salute between soldiers. She could not prove what Henry was, not yet. But now she knew something the traitor did not know she knew. And in a game like this, that was the only kind of weapon a kitchen maid could carry. Outside, unseen from the small tent, Edward Stone stood alone by the coals of a dying fire, turning a single thought over and over in his mind. During the chaos, from the door of his own tent, the king had been watching his beta too. And kings, like maids, notice things. An hour before dawn, the flap of the small tent opened, and the Alpha King stepped inside alone. Grace rose quickly, but Edward motioned for her to sit, then lowered himself onto the ammunition crate across from her. In the light of the single candle, without his court, without his guards, without his crown, he looked simply like a man who had not slept, carrying a weight that was crushing him slowly. We have very little time, he said quietly, so I will speak plainly, and you will do the same. I placed you under guard tonight for 2 reasons. The first is that it protects you. A suspected spy in custody is not worth silencing. The second reason is that I needed the camp, and one man in particular, to believe I doubt you. Grace's breath caught. You saw it too. I saw a great deal. Edward's jaw tightened. I saw an attack that never touched me. I saw trained fighters die to sell a performance. And from the shadow of my own tent, I saw my beta step between two wagons whole, and step out wounded, when no enemy stood near him. He paused, and for a moment the pain broke through his control, raw and terrible. 15 years, Grace. He carried me off a battlefield on his back. He stood beside me when my father died. I keep searching for another explanation, and every hour there is less room for one. There is no other explanation, Grace said softly. I watched him cut his own shoulder, and when the attackers fled, one of them saluted him, 2 fingers to the brow. Soldiers do not salute strangers. Edward closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the grief had been locked away, and the king had returned. Then we both know, and neither of us can prove it. Which brings me to you, Grace Miller, because Henry asked the one question tonight that I also cannot escape. How does a kitchen maid know the things you know? You identified master sabotage that my best man missed. You read a battlefield like a veteran. You knew the sound of a dying axle over wind and hooves. Wheelwright's daughters learn wood. They do not learn all the rest. He leaned forward. I have trusted you with my life. Trust me with the truth. Who are you? The candle flame trembled. Grace looked down at her scarred hands, and the wall she had built around her past for 6 long years began to crack, stone by stone. You will not like it, she whispered. I have not liked anything for 2 days. Speak. My name was not always Miller. I was born Grace Ashford. She watched the name land, watched his eyes widen slightly, because everyone in the 7 territories knew that name, even though no one spoke it anymore. My father was Master William Ashford, court physician, engineer, and counselor to the Alpha of the Silverbrook Pack. I grew up in Silverbrook Hall. I learned healing from my father, mechanics from the royal wheelwright who was his dearest friend, and the reading of men's faces from a court that was drowning in politics. I was 14 years old on the night your father's armies came. The words fell into the tent like stones into still water. The destruction of the Silverbrook Pack, the old king's final war, the burned hall, the scattered survivors, the ugly rumors that had never quite died about why a peaceful border pack had been branded traitor and erased in a single season. I ran with the smoke behind me, Grace continued, her voice flat and distant now, the voice of someone reciting a story about a stranger, because that was the only way she could tell it at all. I buried my name in a village graveyard and took the name of a dead miller's daughter. I worked farms, then inns, then kitchens, moving every year, always west, until I ended up in the last place anyone would look for an Ashford of Silverbrook, the palace of the king whose father destroyed us. It felt safe. Fires do not return to burned ground. She lifted her eyes to his. So now you know why I hear plots in cellars and read faces by firelight, Your Majesty. I have spent 6 years listening for footsteps behind me. You learn a great deal in the dark. For a long time, Edward said nothing. He had been raised on the official history, that Silverbrook had conspired with the eastern enemies, that the strike had been a bitter necessity. He had been a young man on a distant front when it happened, and he had wondered, in private, more than once, why the records of that campaign were sealed even from him. If you hated us, he said at last, no one would blame you. My family took everything from yours, yet you threw yourself at my carriage and made yourself a target to save my life. Why? Grace was quiet for a moment. This was the question she had asked herself every night since the cellar, and she gave him the only honest answer she had found. Because I know what it is to have my world decided by other people's plots, she said. Someone lied about Silverbrook, and thousands died. Now someone is lying around you, and if you die on a mountain road, the summit collapses, the territories go back to war, and 100,000 children end up running from smoke the way I did. I could not carry that, not when a warning cost me nothing but my safety. She hesitated, then added, more quietly, and there is something else, Your Majesty, though I cannot explain it. From the moment you looked at me in that courtyard, something in me refused to let you die. I do not know what it is. I have stopped trying to name it. Edward went very still, because he did know what it was, or at least he suspected, with a certainty that had been growing in his chest since the courtyard, since her scent had drifted to him under the smoke and herbs, and stirred something ancient and undeniable. He had told himself it was impossible. Such bonds were the stuff of old stories. But sitting in this small tent, a breath away from her, the pull was so strong it was almost painful, and he could see in her guarded eyes that she felt it too, and was fighting it just as hard. Neither of them said the word. There was no room for that word in the middle of a hunt for a traitor, on the road to a summit that could save or shatter the world. But the word sat between them in the candlelight all the same, patient and inevitable. Edward stood. Listen carefully, because dawn is coming, and everything now depends on the next 3 days. We will proceed to the summit, as if nothing has changed. Henry will remain trusted, honored, and completely unaware. You will remain under guard, disgraced and dismissed, which makes you the one person in this convoy. The traitor will stop watching. Oliver Hart will know the truth, no one else. At the summit, you will serve in the halls, invisible, as only servants can be, and you will do what you were born doing. Watch, listen, remember, Henry did not build this plot alone. He has allies among the Eastern delegations, and he will have to meet them, or signal them, and when he does, we will finally have our proof. And if his next strike comes before we find it? Grace asked. Edward paused at the tent flap, and his answer was quiet and grim. Then it will come at the summit, in a hall filled with 4 rival kings, where a single death can be blamed on anyone, and one spark will burn the whole world. Which is why, Grace Ashford, for the next 3 days, you and I are the only 2 people alive who can stop it. He was gone before she could reply, into the gray light of dawn, and moments later she heard his voice outside, cold and public, informing the camp that the suspect Maid would remain in custody, that the beta should rest his wound, and that the convoy would ride within the hour. Grace sat alone as the camp woke around her, her buried name alive again in the air of the tent, her heart beating with fear, and with that other thing she refused to name. 3 days, she thought. 3 days to catch a traitor no one else could see, in a fortress full of enemies, with no proof, no allies, and no room for a single mistake. She had survived the burning of Silverbrook with nothing but her wits. They would have to be enough one more time. Stonewatch Keep appeared on the 3rd evening, like a crown of fire on the horizon. The ancient fortress had been chosen for the summit, precisely because it belonged to no one. Built on neutral ground where 4 territories met, its towers blazed with the banners of 4 packs, and its gates had swallowed 4 royal columns in a single day. Never in living memory had the Alpha Kings of the North, South, East, and West slept under one roof. The air inside the walls hummed with tension, ceremony, and 10,000 hidden calculations. Edward's convoy arrived last, battered and reduced, and the story of the mountain attack ran through the fortress ahead of them like wind through grass. By the time the Alpha King of the West dismounted in the great courtyard, every delegation had heard that someone had tried to stop him from arriving. Suspicion crackled between the 4 camps. The Eastern Alpha, a huge silver-haired man named Marcus Thorne, publicly offered his outrage and his sympathy. The Southern and Northern Kings watched everyone. The summit had not even begun, and already it balanced on the edge of a knife. Which was exactly, Grace understood, what the plotters wanted. She entered Stonewatch not through the great gates, but through the servants' passage, hands bound in front of her for show, listed on the rolls as a suspected informant kept close for questioning. By nightfall the bindings were gone, and she wore the plain brown dress of the fortress serving staff, and just as Edward had predicted, she vanished. Nobles do not see servants. Guards do not see servants. Traitors, busy watching kings and captains, do not see servants. Servants, however, see everything. For 2 days, while the 4 kings sat in the great hall and argued borders, trade roads, and old grievances, Grace moved through the fortress like a ghost with a water jug. She learned the rhythms of the kitchens and the corridors within hours. She noted which doors were guarded and which were merely closed, which stairwells echoed and which were silent, which servants belonged to which delegation, and, most carefully of all, she charted every movement of Henry Cross. The beta was magnificent. His arm rode in a sling that he shrugged off with modest courage at every opportunity. He charmed the northern delegation, drank with the southern captains, and worked tirelessly at Edward's side, the very picture of loyalty. He made no suspicious contact, sent no messages, walked no dark corridors. He was, Grace thought grimly, far too disciplined to be caught doing anything at all. But on the 2nd evening, she noticed the wine steward. His name was Peter Vane, a soft-footed man with pale eyes who directed the service of the high table. where 4 kings ate and drank in careful ceremony. Everything about him was correct. Too correct. He tasted every bottle before the kings were served, as the law of the summit required. He handled every decanter himself. And twice, from her post by the western door, Grace watched Marcus Thorne of the East glance at Peter Vane with the flat, incurious look a man gives his own furniture. Familiar. Owned. On the third evening, the summit reached its most dangerous hour. The kings had agreed in principle to the great treaty, and tradition demanded that agreement be sealed with a shared cup, 1 decanter, 1 wine, poured by 1 steward into 4 royal cups while the whole hall watched. 200 nobles, captains, and courtiers filled the great hall. Musicians played. The treaty lay on the high table, waiting for morning and 4 signatures. Grace stood against the western wall, with a linen cloth over her arm, and every instinct she possessed was screaming. Because she had been in the wine cellars an hour before, unnoticed among a dozen hurrying servants, and she had seen Peter Vane prepare the ceremonial decanter alone at a side table. She had seen him taste the wine himself, correctly, lawfully, in front of 2 witnesses. And then, for half a heartbeat, as he set the tasting cup down, she had seen his thumb pass over the decanter's ornate silver collar and press it, and she had seen a ring on that thumb turn once, and she was almost certain, that something had fallen from the hollow of that ring, through the silver collar, into the wine below. Almost was the whole problem. She had perhaps 20 minutes and no proof at all. A hidden mechanism in a ceremonial decanter could not be checked without seizing it, and seizing the treaty decanter in front of 4 courts on the word of a disgraced maid would shatter the summit as surely as any assassination. If she was wrong, the treaty died and the war came. If she said nothing and was right, kings died tonight, and the war came anyway. She looked for Oliver Hart and could not find him in the crowded hall. She caught Edward's eye once, for an instant, across 200 heads, but there was no signal on earth that could carry this. The horns sounded. The ceremony began. Peter Vane walked the length of the great hall with the silver decanter raised high, and the crowd fell silent. He poured the deep red wine into 4 royal cups, 1 for each king, exactly equal, as tradition required. The 4 alpha kings rose and took their cups. Marcus Thorne of the East smiled and lifted his highest of all as he began the ancient toast. Grace watched the wine tremble in Edward's cup, and time seemed to slow. She thought of the smooth voice in the cellar. The world will call it an accident, and no one will ever look deeper. 4 kings dead or dying at a peace table would not be called an accident. It would be called betrayal. Each surviving faction would blame another, unless, of course, the poison was chosen not to kill instantly, but to strike hours later, in the night, separately, in their own chambers. Illness, bad fortune, a cursed treaty. And she remembered one more thing, the thing that decided everything. Marcus Thorne had lifted his cup with a smile, but during the pouring, Grace, who had spent 6 years reading faces, had watched his hand, and Marcus Thorne had subtly, almost invisibly, changed his grip so that his fingers covered the small enamel mark on 1 cup. He knew the cups. His was safe. The poison was already divided among the other 3, or in the pour itself, and there was no more time to reason it through. The toast ended. 4 cups rose toward 4 mouths. Grace stepped away from the wall, crossed the open floor in front of 200 frozen witnesses, and did the only thing that no law, no ceremony, and no traitor could stop. "Your Majesty," she called out clearly, "the wine is false, and I will prove it." And before a single guard could reach her, before Edward's shout could cross the hall, before Peter Vane's pale eyes had even finished widening, Grace Ashford took the cup from the king's hand and drank it to the bottom. The hall detonated into chaos. Guards surged from every wall. The northern king hurled his own cup away from him. Marcus Thorne was on his feet roaring about insult and madness. Edward had crossed the space between himself and Grace before the cup even left her lips, and he caught her by the shoulders as she lowered it, his face stripped of every mask he had ever worn. "What have you done?" he breathed. "What have you done?" "Now watch the steward," Grace whispered, because that was the trap inside her sacrifice. Whatever was in that wine, Peter Vane knew, and Peter Vane now had seconds to decide whether to stand still while the evidence spread through her blood in front of the finest healers of 4 kingdoms. Healers who would identify the poison and trace its rare ingredients, or to run. Peter Vane looked at the maid who had drunk his masterpiece. His nerve broke. He ran. He made it 11 steps before Oliver Hart came out of the crowd like a thrown spear, and brought him down, and the silver decanter, dropped in his flight, struck the stone floor, and split at its false collar, spilling a fine white residue that had no business being inside the sacred vessel of the summit, in front of 200 witnesses and 4 Alpha Kings. The proof, at last, undeniable, public, seen by every faction at once. Grace saw it, and something in her unlocked with relief, which was the exact moment the poison reached her. The great hall tilted, the torches smeared into ribbons of light. She heard, as if from underwater, 4 kings shouting, guards bellowing for healers, Peter Vane screaming a name as Oliver's knee pinned him, and she thought, distantly, that she needed to stay awake long enough to hear which name it was. She could not. Her legs gave way. She never felt the floor. Strong arms caught her before she reached it, and the last thing Grace Ashford knew was the Alpha King of the West, on his knees, in the middle of the wrecked ceremony, holding her against his chest, roaring for every healer in Stonewatch Keep, in a voice that shook dust from the ancient stones, a voice no one present had ever heard from him, and no one present would ever forget. And beneath the fading thunder of that voice, close against her ear, low and shaking, words meant for no one else. Stay with me. That is a command, Grace. Stay with me. Then the dark closed over her, and she heard nothing at all. For 3 days, Grace Ashford lay between life and death in the Healer's Tower of Stonewatch Keep, and for 3 days, the most feared Alpha King in the 7 territories did not leave her side. The healers of 4 kingdoms worked over her together, rivals united by a single patient, because whether she lived or died had become a matter of state. The white residue from the broken decanter was identified within hours as ghost lily extract, a rare, slow poison from the far eastern marshes, chosen because it mimicked natural illness and killed quietly, a day after drinking. Chosen, the healers agreed grimly, by someone with wealth, patience, and access to eastern trade roads. The full cup Grace had swallowed was many times the intended dose, and by every rule of their art, she should already be gone. She was not gone. And on the second night, the healers discovered why, and the discovery ran through Stonewatch like fire. The old healer of the northern delegation, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Hale, had been studying the strange herbs found in a small pouch among Grace's belongings. Herbs the girl had clearly been dosing herself with daily for years. Bitterroot, gray sage, and winterbloom, in careful proportion. Margaret had read of that mixture only once, in a book so old it was falling to dust. It had one purpose. It was a suppressor. It was taken by those who needed to hide what they were, to mute the signals of blood and instinct, to make the extraordinary smell ordinary. And as the poison burned through Grace's body, it burned the suppressor out with it, layer by layer, year by year, until on the second midnight, with Edward gripping her hand in the candlelit tower room, the last of the herbs faded from her blood, and what she had been hiding for 6 years rose to the surface all at once. The bond hit Edward like lightning striking the tower. He shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward, his breath gone, every sense flooded. The muted pull he had felt since the courtyard, the strange gravity he had refused to name, tore its disguise away and roared through him at full force, ancient and absolute and unmistakable. Every alpha was raised on the old stories and taught to dismiss them. One soul in 1,000 generations found its true counterpart. It was legend, it was myth. It was standing in this room, and it had been peeling potatoes in his kitchens, and it was dying in this bed, because it had taken poison out of his hand and drunk it to save his life. Margaret Hale watched the towering Alpha King sway on his feet, watched his eyes when he turned to her, and simply nodded. Yes, Your Majesty, that is what it is. She has been suppressing it since before she ever reached your palace. This girl has known what you were to her for a very long time, I think, and she chose to serve in your kitchens in silence rather than reveal her name to claim it. Edward looked down at Grace, at her still face, at the slow, stubborn rise and fall of her breathing, and the full shape of her choice broke over him. She had carried the bond alone. She had muted it with bitter herbs every morning, standing in the household of the bloodline that had destroyed hers, asking for nothing, telling no one, And when the moment came, she had spent her hidden, extraordinary life without hesitation, like a coin, to buy his. The most powerful man in the West sank back into the chair beside the bed, lifted her limp hand, and pressed it to his forehead, and Margaret Hale quietly left the room, because some things are not for witnesses. The bond, once revealed, cut both ways. The healers said afterward that they had never seen a poisoning fought the way Grace's body fought that night, as if she were drawing strength through the joined line itself, as if something on the other end simply refused to let her go. Perhaps it was medicine. Perhaps it was the old stories waking up. On the third morning, Grace Ashford opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was Edward asleep in the chair beside her bed, unshaven, still dressed in the clothes from the ceremony, her hand held in both of his. The first thing she felt was the bond, unsuppressed for the first time in 6 years, filling the room like sunlight, and she knew instantly by his face when he woke that he finally felt it too, and that every wall between them had burned down while she slept. Neither of them spoke of it for a long moment. There were no words yet invented for it. "You disobeyed me," Edward said at last, his voice rough. "I ordered you to stay. You took 3 days." "I have always been a poor servant," Grace whispered, and the great Alpha King laughed once, helplessly, and bowed his head over her hand. Then, because the world does not pause for miracles, she asked the question that had followed her into the dark. "The steward. Before I fell, he was screaming a name. Whose?" Edward's face hardened, and the warmth in the room cooled by degrees. "Peter Vane has talked for 3 days, trading truth for his life. He named his paymaster in the East. He named the courier chain. He named the man inside my own convoy, who gave him the schedule of the ceremony and the seal to reach the cellars." He paused. "He named Henry." Grace closed her eyes. Even expected, it landed like a blow. "There is more, and it is worse," Edward continued quietly. Vane knew only his peace, but his peace pointed upward. The ghost lily came through Marcus Thorne's trade roads under falsified seals. The gray men from the mountain camp carried Eastern steel. "Henry is not the head of this, Grace. He is the western hand of something larger, an arrangement between the Alpha of the East and traitors inside at least 2 other courts, built to bury this treaty and carve up the territories in the war that would follow." His jaw tightened. "And here is the blade's edge we now stand on. Thorne sits at my table every day, wearing sympathy. Henry sits at my right hand, wearing loyalty. Vane's testimony alone is a servant's word against a beta and a king. And the moment we move openly without more, the East burns the evidence, blames the West, and the war begins anyway, with us as the villains of the story." "Then Henry does not know. Vane has named him," Grace said slowly, understanding. "No one knows. Vane is held in secret and reported dead of his own poison, a lie the healers have sworn to. As far as Stonewatch Keep knows, the conspiracy died with the steward, the treaty is saved, and the signing was merely delayed while the hero of the summit fought for her life." A grim, cold light came into Edward's gray eyes, and Grace saw in it the general who had never lost a campaign. "Henry believes he is safe, and cornered men are dangerous, but safe men are careless. He has lost his poison, his steward, and his mountain assassins, and the treaty he was paid to prevent will be signed in this fortress in 4 days, at the great ceremony of seals. He has 1 move left and 4 days to make it, and this time, Grace, we will not be catching an axle or a decanter. This time we set the trap," Grace finished softly. "This time we set the trap." Edward rose, and though exhaustion still marked his face, he suddenly looked like the most dangerous man alive. "The whole fortress watched you drink from my cup. There is not a soul in Stonewatch, king or kitchen boy, who does not now know your face and your name. Your days as an invisible servant are over, so we will give them something even better to look at." At the door, he glanced back, and something that was almost a smile touched his mouth. "Rest, heal, and prepare yourself. Grace Ashford of Silverbrook. In 4 days, at the ceremony of seals, you will stand at the front of that hall, in a place of honor, before 4 courts. Bait, shield, witness, and reckoning, all at once. Henry's last move will have to come through you, and when it comes, we will finally take everything from him at the very moment he reaches for everything from us." Grace lay back against the pillows, feeling the bond hum quietly along that invisible line, out of the room, down the tower stairs, wherever he went now, and she realized that for the first time in 6 years, she could feel exactly where he was. 4 days. Somewhere in the fortress below, Henry Cross was smiling at Kings, mourning a dead steward he had murdered with a false report, and sharpening his final move. He had no idea that the kitchen maid was awake. He had no idea what she was. He had no idea what was coming. The next 4 days inside Stonewatch Keep were the strangest of Grace's life, a silent war fought entirely with smiles. By day, the fortress celebrated her. The story of the maid who drank the king's cup had traveled to every tower and stable, growing larger with each telling. The northern king sent her winter roses. The southern queen mother sent a silk shawl. Soldiers who had once looked at her with suspicion now touched their brows when she passed. Edward compounded it all by announcing that the woman who saved 4 crowns would stand in the place of honor at the ceremony of seals, and the fortress approved with all its heart. Henry Cross approved most loudly of all. He visited the healer's tower himself on the first afternoon, sat at Grace's bedside with his arm still in its sling, and thanked her, warmly, gracefully, at length, for her courage. He apologized, with what looked like real shame, for having doubted her on the mountain. He held her hand between both of his when he left. Grace smiled, thanked him for his kindness, and let her hand rest in the hands of the man who had ordered her death twice. And when the door closed behind him, she sat very still for a long time, learning what it cost to wear a mask against a master of masks. By night, the real work happened. Oliver Hart came in darkness, through the servant's stair, and piece by piece, the counter-trap was built. Vane's secret testimony had given them the shape of Henry's last resource. The steward, the assassins, and the poison had all been instruments, but the conspiracy's true prize inside Stonewatch was something else, a small cadre of sworn men, perhaps a dozen, seated among the fortress garrison and the visiting delegations over many months. Sleepers who did nothing, carried nothing, and communicated with no one, waiting for a single signal that would only be given if everything else failed. Vane did not know their faces. He knew only what he had once glimpsed on a courier's slip, the phrase that would wake them, and the plan they existed to serve. If the treaty could not be poisoned quietly, it would be shattered loudly. At the ceremony of seals, in the moment all 4 kings stood unarmed and together at the treaty table, the sleepers would strike, not to win, but to make each delegation believe another delegation had attacked, and let 4 armies do the rest. Henry himself would be standing beside Edward when it happened, blameless, grieving, and positioned to inherit command of the West in the chaos that followed. It was, Oliver admitted flatly, a brilliant design, because it required Henry to do almost nothing that could ever be traced. Almost nothing. He still had to give the waking signal. And a signal, Grace pointed out from her sickbed, is a thing with 2 ends. If they could not find the sleepers, they could make sure that when the signal came, it woke something else entirely. So began the quietest counterattack in the history of the 7 territories, and it was fought by an army no one ever notices. Because Grace Ashford had lived for 6 years among the invisible people, and she knew their power. Kitchen staff who hear every careless word at every table. Grooms who know whose horse is saddled for a hard ride and whose is not. Laundresses who know which soldier's clothes smell of cellar dust from a wing he has no duty in. Chambermaids who know who sleeps soundly and who paces all night. No spy network on earth sees what the servants of a great house see, and no one had ever bothered to ask them. Grace asked them, not with orders, and never with the truth, which was too dangerous to share. She asked with small questions, woman to woman, worker to worker, wrapped in gossip and worry. After the poisoning, who could blame the staff for being watchful? Within 3 days, the invisible people of Stonewatch had, without one of them fully realizing it, mapped the fortress for her. 11 names surfaced, men whose habits sat slightly wrong, a guard who oiled his blade twice daily, but stood a post with no threats, a delegation clerk, whose boots were muddied from walls he had no reason to walk, a stable hand, who could not saddle a horse properly. 11 names went to Oliver Hart in the dark, and Oliver's shadow guard confirmed 9 of them within a day, and found the 12th and 13th by watching who those 9 drank with. They did not arrest them. Arrests would warn Henry. Instead, in the last 2 nights before the ceremony, each sleeper was quietly compromised. Blade edges dulled and pinned in scabbards by the armorers, oaths sworn to the fortress, and furious to learn of vipers in their garrison. Duty rosters delicately rewritten by the old steward of Stonewatch, so that each sleeper found himself posted, by pure administrative chance, at a station flanked by 2 of Oliver's men. The fortress closed around the conspiracy like a slow hand, and the conspiracy never felt the fingers. One thread remained, the most dangerous of all: the signal. Vane had glimpsed only its phrase, and the phrase meant the signal would come in words, spoken openly, hidden in ceremony, at the moment of Henry's choosing. They could not gag him. They could not script the ceremony. Henry, as beta of the hosting delegation, held the traditional right to speak the words of witness before the sealing, and there was no way on earth to take that from him without warning him. "Then we do not take it from him," Edward said, on the final night, in the Healer's Tower, where the 3 of them stood over a map of the Great Hall. "We let him stand before 4 courts and speak his signal perfectly. We let him fire the arrow." He looked up, and the cold general's light was in his eyes again. "We have simply moved the target." The morning of the ceremony of seals arrived wrapped in winter sunlight. The Great Hall of Stonewatch had been transformed. Banners of 4 packs hanging together for the first time in history. The treaty gleaming on its ancient oak table. 4 cups of sealing wax in 4 royal colors, and every noble, captain, and courtier of 4 kingdoms packed shoulder to shoulder beneath the stone arches. Rebuilt trust, fragile as first ice, held the room together. One scream, one drawn blade, one falling king, and it would shatter forever. Grace stood at the front, honored and visible, dressed not as a maid, but in deep Silverbrook blue, a choice of color that only 2 other people in the hall understood. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Through the bond she could feel Edward across the hall, a steady banked fire, and she anchored herself to it. The horns sounded. The 4 Alpha Kings walked to the treaty table and stood together, unarmed, as tradition demanded. The hall held its breath, and Henry Cross, Beta of the West, resplendent and solemn, stepped forward to speak the words of witness. He spoke beautifully. He spoke of the long roads all 4 peoples had traveled to reach this table, of wounds given and wounds forgiven. He spoke of the mountain attack and the poisoned cup, of dangers survived, and then, raising his good arm to the banners overhead, he said, in the formal old tongue, the ancient phrase of blessing, that no one in that hall had heard spoken aloud in a generation, and that 13 scattered men had been waiting months to hear. "Let the old debts be paid in full." The signal, fired in front of 2,000 witnesses, perfect and untraceable. Nothing happened. No blades came out of the crowd. No screams tore the arches. The hall simply held its silence, waiting respectfully for the beta to continue, and Grace watched from 12 feet away as Henry Cross, for the first time in 15 years, lost control of his face. It was small, a flicker, a fractional widening of the eyes, a half-second of searching the crowd for men who were not moving, because they were standing in dulled armor between shadow guards. But she saw it, Edward saw it, Oliver saw it, and in that half-second, the mask of the perfect beta cracked from the inside. And into that crack, Edward Stone drove the blade he had spent 4 days forging. "Strange words, Henry," the Alpha King said, into the silence, his voice carrying to the last row of the hall. "Let the old debts be paid in full. I agree. Bring him in." The great doors of the hall swung open, and between 2 shadow guards, alive, shackled, and gray with fear, walked Peter Vane, the steward the whole fortress believed dead, and behind him came the armorers of Stonewatch carrying 13 dulled and pinned blades, and Margaret Hale carrying the split silver decanter, and a fortress clerk carrying the seized courier slips, and the hall of 2,000 people understood all at once, in a single rolling thunderclap of sound, that they were no longer watching a sealing. They were watching a reckoning. Henry Cross looked at the evidence walking toward him down the long hall. He looked at the 4 kings turning to face him. He looked, last of all, at Grace Ashford in Silverbrook blue, standing calm as winter in the place of honor, and every remaining piece fell into place behind his eyes, and Grace watched 15 years of performance burn away in a single breath, leaving something bare and cold and terribly familiar. "You," Henry said softly. "It was always you." "No, Henry," Grace answered, and her voice, though quiet, reached the whole listening hall. "It was always you. I only made sure someone finally saw it." What happened next, no one in the great hall would ever forget. Guards moved toward Henry Cross from 3 directions, and Henry did not run. Running was finished, and everyone knew it, most of all him. Instead he straightened, shrugged off the sling he had worn for days over a wound that had long since healed, and laughed, a short, broken sound with no joy in it at all. 15 years, he said, and his voice, stripped of its warm polish, rang harsh against the stones. 15 years I stood at your right hand, Edward, and you never once asked yourself where I came from before the border wars. You never asked anyone. The great houses of the West do not ask where useful men come from. He turned slowly, taking in the 4 kings, the banners, the frozen sea of nobility. So I will tell you now, in front of everyone. Since this is a day for old debts, I was born Henry Crane, in the river quarter of Silverbrook. The word went through the hall like a cold wind. Grace felt the floor tilt under her. Beside the treaty table, Edward had gone very still. I was 19 when the Western armies came, Henry continued, and now no one in that vast hall made a sound. I dug my mother and my 2 sisters out of the ashes of our street with my own hands. And while this girl, his eyes cut to Grace, bright and terrible, ran west and hid in kitchens, I made a different choice. I buried my name, took a dead soldier's papers, joined the very army that had burned my home, and I climbed. Year after year, battle after battle, smile after smile. Until the son of the king who destroyed Silverbrook trusted me with his life, his seal, and his kingdom. He spread his hands. You ask why. There is your why. I did not betray you, Edward. I collected from you. There is a difference. By selling 4 kingdoms into a war that would burn 100 Silverbrooks, Grace said. Her voice shook, but she stepped forward, because someone from Silverbrook had to answer him, and there were only 2 of them left in the world. I grieved the same streets you grieved, Henry. I lost the same world, and I have spent 4 days learning exactly what you built with that grief. Thorn's gold, 13 sleepers, ghost lily in a treaty cup, children in 4 territories who would have spent this winter running from smoke, the way we ran. You did not collect a debt, you became the men who burned us, and you were going to hand the ashes to the east for a chair beside Marcus Thorne. At the high table, Marcus Thorne rose, magnificent in his outrage, and began to declare that the East would not stand accused by a serving girl and a proven traitor, and that was precisely as far as he got, because this too, Edward had spent 4 days preparing. The clerk stepped forward with the courier slips bearing falsified Eastern trade seals. Margaret Hale spoke, coldly and precisely, of Ghost Lily and the 3 marsh roads it can travel, all of them thorns, and Peter Vane, trading the last of his truth for his life, recited dates, amounts, and the names of 2 men in Thorne's own delegation, who were seized at the doors attempting to leave the hall. It was not enough to convict a king, it was more than enough to break one politically, in front of the 2 allies he needed most. The northern and southern kings drew away from Marcus Thorne in full view of 2,000 witnesses, and the eastern alpha stood suddenly and completely alone, his conspiracy unraveled, his deniability in rags. Whatever long reckoning awaited the East, it would come later, through treaties and tribunals and the slow machinery of consequence. The war he had planned for that morning was dead, and every soul in the hall could see it. Which left Henry. The law of the summit was ancient and absolute. Treason unveiled on neutral ground, before the assembled crowns, granted the wronged alpha a single choice, deliverance of the traitor to judgment, or the old way, the honor duel, blade to blade, king against accused, before all witnesses. Everyone in that hall had grown up on stories of the old way. No one had seen it invoked in 50 years. Henry Cross looked at the shackles waiting for him, and then at Edward, and smiled with something almost like his old warmth. You owe me a battlefield, Edward. I carried you off one once. Give me this one. It was not bravado, Grace realized, watching him. It was the last move of a man who had lived 15 years on a single purpose, and had nothing left to return to. He wanted an ending with meaning, or perhaps he simply wanted his king, one final time, to himself. The hall waited. Grace, through the bond, felt the storm in Edward that his face refused to show, grief and fury, and 15 years of memory, and she understood before he spoke that he would not refuse. Some debts between men can only be settled in the old language. They cleared the center of the great hall. 2 blades of equal length were brought and offered. 4 kings stood as witnesses, and 2,000 people held their breath, and Edward Stone and Henry Cross faced each other on the stones where the treaty was to have been signed. The duel was fast, controlled, and heartbreaking, and no chronicler afterward described it in the language of glory, because there was none in it. They knew each other completely. Every feint had been drilled together, every guard learned side by side across 15 years of war, and so for long minutes the hall watched two halves of one history strike and turn and counter, in a terrible, intimate silence, broken only by steel and breath. Henry fought with the freed fury of a man done pretending. Edward fought the way he did everything, patiently, absolutely, and he was, as he had always been, the better blade. It ended when Henry overreached on a strike born of exhaustion, and Edward turned it, closed, and put him down onto the stones with the point of his blade at the hollow of his throat. The hall waited for the ending, the old way demanded. Edward stood over the man who had been his brother, his shadow, his betrayer, and the point of the blade held steady at Henry's throat for 5 full heartbeats. Then the Alpha King of the West spoke, quietly, but the silence carried every word to the walls. My father burned Silverbrook on a lie. His council built that lie, and I inherited its wages, and this morning I finally understand what those wages are. You are what the lie made, Henry. If I finish this the old way, I pay the lie one more life, and my son inherits yours. He straightened and cast the blade aside, and it rang on the stones like a bell. The cycle ends on this floor, judgment, not vengeance, truth, in full, in the light, for Silverbrook, and for everyone the lie has cost. That is the debt paid in full, and it is the only payment that ends this. He turned to the assembled kings, and the frozen hall, and his voice rose. Bear witness, all of you. The West will open the sealed records of the Silverbrook campaign to the judges of all 4 territories, whatever they contain, and whomever they name. The truth will stand in the open. That is the treaty I signed today, beneath the one on the table. And in the roaring tumult that followed, as guards raised the defeated Beta from the stones, Henry Cross looked up at the king he had failed to destroy, and at the maid from Silverbrook who had beaten him with water jugs and laundry lists and open eyes, and the hate in his face flickered, wavered, and gave way to something no one expected, and Grace never forgot. Relief. The exhausted, unbearable relief of a man whose long war was finally over, and whose home, in the only way that still mattered, had just been avenged by his enemy. They led him away. The hall thundered, and amid 2,000 shouting witnesses, across the wreckage of the greatest conspiracy in living memory, the Alpha King of the West looked at Grace Ashford, and Grace Ashford looked back, and through the quiet line that bound them, where no one else could hear, both of them felt the same single word. Done. The Treaty of the 4 Territories was signed that same afternoon, on the same oak table, with the same 4 seals, 1 hour after the stones were cleared. The chroniclers wrote that it was signed in the most watchful peace the 7 territories had ever known. They also wrote, every one of them, about the woman in Silverbrook blue who stood at the king's side as witness, and how, when the 4th seal was pressed, the Alpha King of the West took her hand in front of the assembled crowns of the world and did not let it go. The road home ran west through the first true snow of the year, and it was nothing like the road out. The convoy that had left the capital 3 weeks earlier had carried a king in a beautiful trap, a traitor at his right hand, and a kitchen maid hidden in the servant's wagon. The convoy that returned carried the signed treaty of the 4 territories, a Beta in chains riding under guard, the sealed records of the Silverbrook campaign in an iron chest, and Grace Ashford riding beside the king at the head of the column on a grey mare, in full view of everyone, because Edward had flatly refused to have her anywhere else. They crossed the Blackridge Pass in bright, windless cold, and when the column reached the high road above the great ravine, Edward called a halt at the very place where the axle had failed. The wrecked black carriage still lay against the cliff wall where it had been abandoned, dusted now with snow. The king and the maid stood together at the edge for a long moment, looking down into the blue depths that had been meant to swallow him, and neither said a word, because between them, now, words were often unnecessary. Then Edward gave a quiet order, and before the column moved on, the soldiers tipped the wrecked carriage over the edge. It fell without a sound and vanished, and the men cheered, and the mountains kept their silence, cheated forever of their cargo. The capital, when its towers finally rose out of the winter haze, already knew everything. The story had outrun the convoy by fast rider and trade road, growing as stories do, and the city that had laughed at a maid in a courtyard turned out in the tens of thousands to watch her ride back through the gates beside the king. Grace, who had spent 6 years perfecting the art of being unseen, rode through a snowstorm of cheering, and thrown winter roses with her spine straight and her face burning, and Edward, watching her sideways, smiled more in 1 hour than his court had seen in 10 years. Then came the hard months, because true endings are built, not found. The sealed records of the Silverbrook campaign were opened before judges of all 4 territories, exactly as Edward had sworn on the stones of Stonewatch, and the truth they held was as ugly as Grace had always believed. There had been no Silverbrook conspiracy with the East. There had been forged letters, planted evidence, and invented treason, built by 5 members of the old King's Council, who had wanted Silverbrook's mines, its river tolls, and its removal from the map, and who had fed a grieving, iron-willed old king the lie he was already inclined to believe. 3 of the 5 still sat on Edward's council, gray and honored, and had sat there smiling through every meeting since. Edward summoned the full court to the great hall of the capital, read the findings aloud himself, every page, in a silence like deep water, and had the 3 arrested where they sat. They were tried in the open, before Silverbrook survivors gathered from across the territories, and judged, and the judgment was recorded beside the restored name of the Silverbrook Pack in the Great Book of the Realm. The official history was corrected in every archive. The word traitor was struck from beside Silverbrook's name forever, and the word wronged was written in its place. On the first day of spring, in the river valley where Silverbrook Hall had once stood, the King of the West knelt in the young grass before 800 gathered survivors and their children, and formally begged forgiveness for the crime of his father's crown. He endowed the rebuilding of the valley from the royal treasury, restored every stolen title and holding that could be traced, and established, in law, that the heirs of Silverbrook held perpetual seats at the Western Council table, so that no lie could ever again be told about them in a room they were not in. Henry Cross was present that day, by his own request and under guard, permitted to stand at the edge of the crowd in the valley where he had been born. The judges had weighed his treason against the lie that had forged him, and rendered the sentence Edward had asked for, not the old way, but life, labor, and truth, his full testimony against the Eastern conspiracy given openly, his remaining years bound in service to the rebuilding of the valley he had avenged so terribly. Grace watched him that spring morning, as the first foundation stone of the new hall was set, an aging man in plain clothes among the workers, and she saw him lay his hand flat against the stone for a moment, and she chose, deliberately, to let that be the last time she ever thought of him with anger. Marcus Thorne never faced a courtroom, but he faced something crueler to a king. The evidence unveiled at Stonewatch, circulated to every court by the northern and southern crowns, cost him his alliances, his trade roads, and finally his throne, taken from him within the year by his own council, in favor of a niece who signed the treaty her uncle had tried to poison. The peace of the 4 territories, born in ambush and sealed in a reckoning, held, and then held again, and then simply became the way the world was, watched over by a generation of rulers who had all, in one hall, on one morning, seen exactly what the alternative looked like. And through all of it, through the trials and the restorations and the slow mending of the world, the Alpha King of the West and the last daughter of Silverbrook built, quietly and stubbornly, the thing that had been waiting for them since a cold morning in a palace courtyard. He did not rush her, and she did not rush herself. The bond hummed between them through every day of that long winter and spring, patient as sunrise, while Grace learned the strange work of being visible, sitting beside judges as a witness, standing before survivors as one of their own, walking palace corridors where she had once carried water, and hearing herself addressed as "my lady" by people who had once not seen her at all. She refused 4 separate honors Edward tried to give her, and accepted only one, the restored title that was hers by blood, Lady Ashford of Silverbrook, and she wore it the way she did everything, plainly and without performance. They argued about council appointments, and agreed about almost everything else. He learned that she still woke before dawn out of kitchen habit and could not be broken of it. She learned that the most feared man in the 7 territories was hopeless at chess and graceful about losing. The court learned that its king laughed now, and gradually stopped remarking on it. And on the first morning of true summer, 1 year to the day, after a maid had seized the reins of a carriage in a crowded courtyard, the household of the Western Palace was summoned, all of it, from the chancellor to the newest kitchen girl, to that same courtyard, without explanation. A carriage stood in the center of the yard. A new one, plainly built, without gold or crest, its timber pale and fresh. The crowd murmured and wondered. And then the King of the West walked out of the palace doors, alone, crossed the courtyard through the parting crowd, and stopped in front of Grace Ashford, exactly where she had once stood, between two guards, with leather reins burning her palms. "A year ago, on this spot," Edward said, and his voice carried to every wall, "a woman I had never met offered her life for mine, and asked for nothing. Everything I have, beginning with my heartbeat, I have because she gave it back to me. I am not here to elevate her. No power I hold reaches that high." And before the assembled household, before the chancellor and the guards and the kitchen staff Grace had once worked beside, the Alpha King of the West went down on one knee on the courtyard stones. "Grace Ashford of Silverbrook, not as your king, as the man whose life you carry, marry me." Grace stood in the summer morning with her heart shaking, the way it had shaken on this spot a year ago, and looked down at the kneeling king, and through the bond there flowed between them, both directions at once, a certainty that made the question almost unnecessary. Almost. "On one condition," she said, and the whole courtyard heard the smile inside her voice. "This time, I inspect the carriage." The courtyard dissolved into laughter and cheering, and, from the direction of the kitchen staff, open weeping, and the King of the West rose and kissed the hand of the woman who had saved 4 kingdoms, with a warning nobody wanted to hear. They were married in autumn, in the rebuilt valley of Silverbrook, beneath banners of West and blue, with 4 crowns in attendance, and Margaret Hale grumbling happily about the cold. The chroniclers of 4 territories recorded the day at length, the treaty kings reunited in peace, the restored hall, the survivor bride. But in the Western Palace, among the people who serve and see everything, the story is told differently, and more simply, and it is told to every new kitchen girl on her first frightened morning, so that she will understand from the beginning what kind of house she has come to. Once, they tell her, a maid from these kitchens saw a terrible thing coming, and she was nobody at all, and she spoke anyway, and the whole world turned on it. So keep your eyes open, girl, and if you ever see the trap before the kings do, say so, and say it loudly. In this house, we know what a warning is worth. And when the wedding day ended, long after the guests and the crowns and the chroniclers had gone, 2 people walked out together under the autumn stars to where a plain, pale carriage stood waiting to carry them home. And this time, with no one watching and no one laughing, the King of the West held the door, and the maid who had once seized the reins to keep him out of a carriage took his hand and climbed in beside him.